Hi, folks. We are just going to give it a couple minutes for folks to join. This is going to feel like the longest 2 minutes ever, Jeff, while I'm staring at you in that Chewbacca mask.
I'm gonna have to keep this as a secret weapon.
And just use it in our normal meetings at Cortex.
That's exactly when I need to scare people off.
Good idea.
I got about 5 more minutes. I can wear this thing, especially right before we get to some of the comments that I'll be making.
Yeah. I see we have a fair number of folks who've just joined. Jeff and I are just killing time for a couple of minutes to let a few more folks cycle in.
A little hurtful, Lauren, for you to say that's just killing time when you're talking to me.
Yeah, sorry about that. Oh, someone's here from Nigeria. Alrighty, so it's about 2 after, so I think it's time to get started. I'm excited about this one. Thanks y'all for joining us today on Halloween, which is why Jeff and I are dressed the way that we are. This is shining a light on dev productivity, what developers want from their IDP. You'll notice my hair is a little bit different from this photo. Today I'm dressed as Mia Wallace from Pulp Fiction. But I'm Lauren Craigie. I look after product marketing at Cortex. And with me here is Jeff Schnitter, and he is one of our solutions architects. But Jeff, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, yeah. You'll see me a little bit later when I take off the mask because it is getting a little bit hot in here. But I am new to Cortex, been there about 3 months. And I recently implemented Cortex at my previous employer, Workday. So happy to talk to all of you today.
And Jeff, what were you doing at Workday and how long were you there?
I was a developer experience architect. I was there for 16 years. So spent a lot of time in CI/CD, build processes, release automation, test automation. So I've seen quite a bit of the developer experience landscape.
Awesome, thank you. All right. Jeff and I mentioned that we both work for Cortex. If you haven't heard of Cortex, it's an internal developer portal. It helps engineering teams centralize standards of quality and consistency using data from across their stack. So using data from your existing tooling you have right now, some of that tooling Jeff just mentioned, to drive progress to goals, initiatives that you might have set up, things like production readiness, operational efficiency, even security, maturity, or compliance, really whatever sort of engineering initiatives or standards you might have. And in doing that, it kind of helps reduce operational overhead for developers working towards moving the business forward. And we're going to talk more about that on this webinar. Really quickly as well, we are backed by Sequoia and IDP. We just closed our Series B in May, I want to say, Jeff. You don't know, yes. You weren't here back then. That brings our total funding up to 53 million. We've got customers from lots of different verticals. Jeff, keep me honest here, but I would say the engineering teams that we serve tend to range from, I think, as small as 50 engineers all the way up to 10,000 plus engineers. Does that sound right to you?
Yes, it is.
Great. So today's agenda here, we are talking about developer productivity. It would be really difficult to have this conversation without touching on some of the debate that's happening in the space right now around measuring productivity. But the focus of this webinar is actually on the types of tooling and systems that developers themselves are looking for in order to make their work more productive, as well as what would have the biggest impact on the business. And then we're going to talk about how IDPs kind of help close the gap between those two things. So let's start here talking about a different part of the productivity debate here. What I'm showing here is something that I really like. This is Gerge Arotz and like Kent Beck had a response to the engineering productivity debate when McKinsey came out with some of their recent metrics. And I'm going to talk more about that in a second. But I wanted to start here because I really like their framework for thinking through this problem. Neither of these individuals are associated with Cortex, not affiliated with this webinar in any way, but I really like the way that they think. And I think if you've been in this space long enough and you're not following them, I think you'd have a lot to learn from just giving them a follow on LinkedIn or on Twitter. But essentially, they wanted to map out what are the different phases of producing software that engineering teams need to go through. And then what they did was overlay a couple different frameworks for measuring productivity on top of this model. And what they found in some of their recent writings is that there are some frameworks that weight really heavily towards business outcomes and maybe focus a little bit less on individual contributions. So you'll notice DORA metrics is focused a little bit less on individual effort from developers, but more on the outcomes that we can measure and then the impact on the business. Whereas they believe McKinsey's latest metrics weight kind of in the opposite direction, focused a little bit more on the individual developer and a little bit less on the outcome and impact to the business. And there's different reasons for why these models are set up differently. It has to do with different motivations across the different models. So maybe if we're looking for a specific engineering outlier, we might be focused more on their activities. If you're focused more on uplifting the business, you might weight your analysis towards the impact and outcome. But we're not really here to talk about which model is best. What I do want to do is use this kind of framework to point out a really key topic here, which is the distance between effort and impact. What we're trying to do today is share activities that individual contributors, individual developers, things that they think make their work better, that also have really significant impact on the business. So the types of activities that help kind of shorten the loop there. We're never going to skip it all together. We don't go from effort to impact. We don't go from lines of code to doubling a company's ARR, right? But there are activities that we can focus on that do tighten that loop a little bit more. So let's go into some survey results that we have. We've kind of established the types of activities we're looking for, things that optimize the way a developer works, things that reduce toil. That's better for their personal developer experience, but also things that help drive the business forward. Let's take a look specifically at what engineers would like to see from productivity tooling. We did a bit of research here in product marketing. This is kind of the bulk of my responsibility. The company is doing market research, customer research, understanding what drives individual engineering teams forward and the jobs to be done. So did a survey of 50 vetted software developers and engineers, mostly ICs, which is important to note, on their top pains, preferences, and areas of focus. We then asked them to prioritize features related to productivity tooling. We noticed 3 key trends that we're going to dive into in a second, and I'm also going to ask for some of Jeff's thoughts on the types of things that he noticed while in his role as well at Workday. But the 3 top themes we noticed were basic inability to find information is still a huge pain for developers. Feels like it should be something easy to fix. We have lots of different tooling available right now. We have a heavy focus on productivity and efficiency at most organizations by now. So it is tough to see that this is still a pain for most folks. The next is that prioritization is a major problem. This topic is pretty nuanced, and we're going to talk about the 2 sides of the coin on this one. But it's still essentially a pain for developers to decide what to work on next based on what the business's needs are, what's showing up in their individual alert queue, or the tools that they're using, and how to balance those things. And then the third major trend we noticed that elimination of rote work is the most requested feature, which I thought was pretty interesting. Well, again, we'll talk more about this in a second, but the fact that the top 2 pains seem to be around finding information, prioritizing tasks. But if you were to ask developers, what do you want to see more of in productivity tooling? The focus always goes to self-service, templating, ability to move quickly towards the end of the SDLC. So double clicking on one of the findings here, finding information is still a top pain. We just very simply asked, how difficult is it to find information like ownership, documentation, changes made, dependencies about software that you own? We do have kind of a far-ranging answer here from folks that responded. but we still see kind of a pain happening here. A lot of folks responded with, it feels like about an 8 in terms of pain in finding information. And I really like this quote as well that came from that same survey when asked to provide more information. I can't keep track of infrastructure for different environments. Knowing what microservices are available to me in my role would have prevented me from developing things that were already available. So not being able to access information has impacts to developer onboarding. Incident management would be a big one as well. But also just developing new software, making sure that you're not being redundant and you're actually using the tools that are available to you. Jeff, you and I talked about this one a little bit before when we were going through the webinar the other day. How did this present itself at Workday?
Well, thanks for that segue, Lauren, because I think it gives me the opportunity to take off my mask. I know this is kind of like
You're free.
the unveiling of a Scooby-Doo villain. It is me. Here I am. The way that this manifested at Workday, I think, is that I saw Workday grow from a small company. I joined when they were less than 100 employees to the point they were about 17,000 or 18,000 by the time I left. And what ends up happening, I see, is that there are a lot of tools that get developed in silos. And so a team will build, whether it's Jira or CI/CD or their development flow or their infrastructure databases. And what ends up happening is that you have these definition tables for all of your services, and they don't all quite align. So you're going to look from Jira for some bug tickets, and then you want to go take a look at source repositories, or you want to take a look at your infrastructure tracking, and you can't make that connection. And you have slight nuances on the way that those names are different. So there's a lot of digging. You have to find out, well, what does this mean to you guys? You created it. And so I think that 8 was really a key pay point, and Workday had tried to build their own internal developer portal to try to deal with that.
Yeah, the thing about the way you just described that problem is that that feels real for even somebody like me in marketing. When an organization grows too quickly, I've been on marketing teams that grew from 3 people on the team in a startup environment to more than 40. And when that happens, because everybody wants to move really quickly, you end up developing silos, and nobody sets out to do that. But I think that this is a sort of problem that anybody at an organization would understand, that it's not unique to just engineering. And sometimes it feels unavoidable. Do you want to move fast, or do you want to like go together? And that's kind of where the gap is right now.
Yeah, that's been interesting for me to go from a very big company like Workday to a smaller company like Cortex. And I find that you can move very fast, but you're going to not necessarily have all the documentation that you need. You're not going to have all the tools set up correctly. And you have to be careful to balance that, because as you get bigger, you might see that that's going to bite you in the end. So you do have to have that balance between going fast and making sure that you're prepared for the future.
Jeff, I don't know what you're talking about. Cortex is perfect. Okay, moving on to the next one here. The next key point, that the need for prioritization is peaking. What we noticed throughout the different questions that we've asked, obviously through our own experience and speaking to developers as well, is that shortage of tooling is not a problem. We have lots of different tools to help us in the way that we work. But then the knock-on effect of that is that there are alerts everywhere, and it's very difficult to compare across different tooling where you want to be focused. And so I really like this one quote from somebody who responded: prioritization is subjective. If there's a way to automate severity assignment, that'd be really helpful. And I really like that that person's kind of forward thinking. Here's what I'm looking for. If anything out there does it, that'd be great. Somebody else had provided a comment, though, that it really wasn't that they didn't know what to focus on. They kind of understood the priorities across tooling, but they were getting a different message from management. You know, if there's a migration that needs to happen suddenly because software is EOLing, or they've decided to switch to a different framework, or we're changing the architecture a little bit, or we're adding in a new business unit, or you're moving to a different team, that feels very much in conflict with what their tools are telling them to focus on. And that's where the point of conflict was starting to come in. Jeff, did you sort of feel that at all at Workday?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's easy if you only have one priority to try to figure that out. And what ends up happening with those silos that you do have, the different teams that are providing inputs, they all have very, very critical asks of your organization. And what I saw at Workday is security might say, we've got a huge initiative that we're working on. And they are typically thinking about the overall security of the product. Development is thinking about adding their new features. The cloud platform team is thinking about, we're going to make some modifications, because you're never standing still with your architecture. It's always changing. And so you've got asks of the development teams to work on their features. you've got asks from security, you've got asks maybe from your platform team, and they're all not likely to bubble up to the same VP or general manager. And so then that prioritization does become very critical. Who's to say that one plan is not more important than the other? Who's going to be the person that says, well, security is way more important than us getting these features out? And so that's where it becomes very, very difficult, even if you have objectives and key results, which Workday had, which is an attempt to try to baseline that across your entire organization. You're still going to have people in those different organizations that feel like their priorities take precedent. And it's really helpful if you can see across the board what they all are.
Yeah, that's a good point. The other kind of area to dig into with prioritization, we mentioned this a bit about the different types of tools that you might have. When we asked folks, what are some of your top pain points in your current role, we had a long list of things, but these were kind of the top 5 answers. 61% said noise from tools makes it difficult to know what to do when. And I think the way that this often presents itself too is just starting to block things out. We've heard of folks who get the same notifications in the same channel. Maybe if support's having an issue with something, a team of engineers in a given Slack channel, maybe there's 100 people there, are all getting that same ping for help. Or an email goes out saying, hey, if this affects you, maybe Log4j as well. If any of your software is affected by Log4j, you've got to go and update it. And when developers get lots of these all the time, they start to tune them out and thinking, if it's that important, they'll come back to me again. And again, this is not unique to engineers. I think this happens to everybody in their given workday. If you're getting pinged by HR, you're getting pinged by marketing for things that you need to go and do, eventually you stop listening to them unless you know that it's targeted to you specifically. Did that same thing sort of happen at Workday as well ever?
You feel like great segues, Lauren, because they absolutely did. When I started at Workday, I was actually the Jira administrator. And I learned a lot about noise from that role because you really couldn't satisfy everybody. That people would either say, I'm not getting notified, I missed this key update, or they'd say, Jira is way too chatty. I just turned it off. I turned everything off, and then I'm going to miss everything. So definitely the noise from the tools is very difficult to manage. There's 2 sides to that story. People want to know everything. People need to turn it off because they're getting notified from other tools. But I also see this manifesting itself in a couple of different ways. Noise from the tools themselves and noise from what are all the tools that I need to use. And to illustrate that a little bit, at Workday, when a team went to get their service from idea to production, there was about 500 discrete steps that they needed to follow. And it was various things that they needed to do with the issue tracker, with CI/CD tools, with performance test environments. And I had a conversation with a colleague I had worked with for a long time. And he said, you know what? Some of this stuff I just don't care about. I want you to tell me how to do it. And I'm happy to take that paved path. For example, at Workday, we had 4 or 5 different CI/CD tools that got built up, whether it was through silos or through acquisitions. And he said to me, you know what? I don't really care. They're all kind of the same. I need to get my code. I want it to work. And so to him, that was noise. That was, I have to pick all of these choices. Help me, give me a paved path. So all I can say is absolutely yes, noise is something that you do have to deal with, and there's no easy fix.
What are some of the consequences that might happen, I guess, to make this more real for folks that might be at smaller organizations and haven't hit this issue yet? What are some of the consequences of missing alerts like that?
Yeah, I think eventually what's going to happen if you miss an alert, and this is often what I've seen happen, is you kind of overcorrect. So, okay, we had notifications weren't chatty enough. We increased their verbosity. Now we're getting too many, so we turn them off. And then some critical notification doesn't get out. So you miss whether it's a key security fix or vulnerability fix, or you didn't know that you had a deadline for PRs to get noticed. And so your code didn't make it to production. Those are the types of things that can happen. It's the type of thing I think you need to be vigilant about, whether you're an organization of 25, 50 people, or even 5,000. You're constantly going to have that balance to make sure you're not overwhelming people, but you're not missing things.
And if I'm in an adjacent team, if I'm like a CISO or another security leader, and I have a particular need to make sure that software is secure, and maybe we don't have like a DevSecOps group set up yet, or we don't really have a phenomenal communication yet between the 2 different teams, does that request have to go through like the engineering leader first and then down to the team? Are the security teams ever pinging people directly and maybe hitting them with noise that way? Have you seen any different examples of that?
Yeah, absolutely. It happens both ways, right? Because to go through the proper channels is probably the required and requested way, so that you're adhering to what the norms are of communication within an organization. But often that's going to be slower. And often you build up these friendships and you know these people in the organization. So they say, you know what, we'll just bypass one or two steps. We're going to go right to the source. And sometimes that works because you have a good working relationship there. But then that message kind of comes back to those C-level folks or your VPs, and you're working, back channel notification way, and that's not going to go over well. And so that kind of gets squashed. And so it's a constant challenge, right? You're trying to really cut out that noise. You're trying to cut out the pieces of work that aren't effective for you. And oftentimes that is trying to get that communication channel properly set up, trying to figure out what should we be working on. And I know that I faced this myself as a developer. I just wanted to get stuff done. And I felt like all of this extra layer was kind of slowing me down. And so I might be a little bit willing to bend the rules a little bit, if I can be honest about that. But you have to be careful about that as well. If you have too many people like that bending the rules, then you're going to start to have a little bit of anarchy, and that's not good for any organization.
Okay, yeah. So it sounds like a big problem with understanding priorities across tooling, navigating some of the politics as well, understanding relationships and how other teams work best, which might not work for some teams, but might work for others. So it sounds pretty complicated.
Yeah. Yeah, I would love to hear from some of the people who are listening today to find out what their stories are about what the challenges are that they've faced.
Yeah, this is a safe space. We can share those stories here. So the third thing that we wanted to talk through here in terms of what developers are looking for before we get into how internal developer portals can close some of the gaps in what developers are looking for and what the business actually needs is eliminating rote work and self-service has become a top request. So I mentioned this earlier, but the fact that some of the top pains have to do with access to information, understanding priorities. If you put a list of different features in front of developers right now and say, a random list of features for productivity tooling, what would make the biggest difference in your day-to-day work? By far, the one that comes up the most, beyond prioritization, which would be nice too, the self-service ability to move things to production quickly, which does make sense. Sorry, I'm like messing with my bangs here as I see them. Actually, I'm going to stop. Okay. Which makes sense that folks are going to focus more on self-service because it's a little bit further along in the software development lifecycle. It feels like it has more immediate impact, and it probably is more of a visceral pain. You get things right to the finish line, and then maybe you get stopped by an operations team saying, actually, this isn't the right way to do it, or actually this thing already exists, or you haven't followed this new set of compliance requirements that you were not aware of because you didn't read that email last week because you had 15 different emails in your inbox. So this one doesn't surprise me as much. And this person, Andre, who's a software engineer, had written, I'm most interested feature-wise in infrastructure orchestration, simplification of configuration management, and a clear framework for deployment management. Jeff, this sounds kind of like the golden paths maybe that you were mentioning earlier. Is that the phrase that you used?
Or a paved path. Yeah.
Paved path, yeah. Can you say more about that and what maybe you felt also at Workday at the final finish line when it felt like you weren't able to move things to production, like help folks understand more of what that feels like maybe?
Yeah, sure. For developers on the call, I'm sure that you felt this pain, that the number of things that you're responsible for becomes very overwhelming. So you often have the feature that you're trying to build and you're familiar with your language of choice and you have an idea really on how you're going to craft that. But there's everything else that you need to consider. The security considerations. Where's it going to run? What are your supported operating systems? What's your maintenance going to be? How are you going to build it? How are you going to test it? What's your framework? How are you going to make sure that it's secure? How are you going to do your vulnerability testing? How are you going to do your performance testing? How are you going to do your load testing? And all of these things start to spread you a little bit thinner as a developer. And it kind of ties back into that noise that you can only know so much about those things. And it makes me, again, think about that comment from the colleague who said, some of these things I don't care about. And by that, he didn't say they're not important. They are things that he knows that there are experts within the company who might be working on them. So if those experts can provide a way that makes it easy for a development team to consume what they need to do from the paved path, that's ideal. Now, you might have development teams that have their own opinionated ways to do that. And ideally, it should be okay to deviate from that paved path or the golden path, as long as you have a list of definitions that you must adhere to for that particular task. So you would really have to be your own expert within that field, that area, to deviate, but there are teams who definitely can do that. And so this comment about the elimination of rote work, I think what often happens is that as that service goes from stage to stage, as it gets on its path to production, there often become these stalling points. So the team itself that might be getting your request might have some automation on how they fulfill it, but it's going to be manually pulled off of a queue, whether it's a Jira ticket or something like that. And so I think what I read from this slide is developers are looking to really eliminate those pauses as their code goes to production. They are looking for help for things that they are not going to be the expert on, or the things that they, and I'll put it in quotes, don't care about, things where they want just that paved path and that golden path to help remove that friction to allow them to get to production. And I start to think about developer portals and how they can help this, where you've got the visibility into each of those steps, each of those teams. Maybe you have automated steps that you can run through your developer portal, or maybe you have templates that you can supply that kind of alleviate some of that burden for those developer teams.
Yeah, and speaking of templates, I think we've heard varying levels of maturity from folks who are facing this challenge. And some companies feel like there is constantly that sort of stop and start, and they haven't really worked out a system for streamlining that in any way. And others feel we do have some templates, we have things that eliminate some need for coding, or some need for manual setup, or some need for reviewing your own checklists, and it kind of has it all in one space. But have you run into situations before where maybe it was difficult for folks to find templates, or they were out of date, or they were inconsistent? Like, what could that look like at larger organizations?
Yeah, I think even at small organizations, it could probably happen. What I saw at Workday was that teams saw the need for templates, because you've got this path from the monolith to microservices that Workday was on, as many companies are on. And so now you break up this big thing into many, 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 many small pieces. And so you've got all of those people developing microservices needing to develop them the same way. And again, it comes back to that problem of, can you know all of these things? Can you be an expert in Kubernetes and Istio and CI/CD tooling? Can you know all of these things? Or do you want to be? So this is where templates, I think, can really help. That people often think about templates as, okay, this is going to be my starting point for my Java application, and I don't need another template. I'm ready to go. But what if you had a template that built that CI/CD tooling on top of it, and you can add to that repository, especially because the templates might come from different teams. And this is what I saw where Workday was challenged, is they were looking really for a central repository where they could have all of the templates together, perhaps all of the templates using the same templating language, a place where developers could come and say, you know what, I started my service by coming to this tool, by coming to the portal. Maybe there are other things I can find there as well. Maybe there are people who are building these templates that I can collaborate with. So that was going to be the next generation that I saw evolving at Workday, was a way to really bring the template people together, find a way that you can chain them together, and be able to start to remove some of those friction points.
Chaining together template people is a nice visual.
I'm going to write a song.
Yeah. Okay, so that's actually a really good segue then. And I agree. I think we see a lot of folks who say, yeah, we've already done templating. We've actually moved to the point, which Workday sounds like they're getting to, in centralizing some of these templates here. But I think the missing step there is that work is not then connected back to how are you making existing software better. You're doing a great job now shipping things out consistently, but what about everything else that kind of already exists? Or what if changes are needed to existing software? How do you stay on top of those? And so that's a good segue to talking more about IDPs and how IDPs close some of these gaps, fulfilling developer needs, but also fulfilling business needs here. So if you haven't heard of internal developer portals before, I gave you a brief summary of what Cortex actually is and how we play in this space right now. But if you remember nothing else about IDPs, there's kind of three main layers to be thinking about. One is probably the most important layer, which enables everything else to be possible, is the system of record, unifying data from across your stack under a common language. When we're thinking about IDPs, the biggest superpower is being able to connect to all of your tooling in the software development lifecycle that you're already using, that you've already invested in, and making that accessible in one place, but also enabling it to be modeled in a way that the data is aware of each other. So you're already doing lots of great things probably with security solutions like Sneak or Git or CI/CD tools like Jeff mentioned earlier, or even some production readiness checklists as well. But the problem is these things are happening in silos again. So you need something to be able to connect all these things into one place and expose that up to a developer so it's easier for them to do their work, and easier for you to also be able to apply standards as well. So that brings us to kind of the next layer there, the assessment phase, just understanding where things are at today, where things live, who owns them, are we missing ownership across different types of assets that we have? And when I say software generally, software assets generally, I mean services, infrastructure, APIs, machine learning models. Jeff, there's probably a long list of other things I'm forgetting.
Topics, AWS resources, S3 buckets. Yeah, it goes on and on and on.
Yeah, Kubernetes clusters. So looking across all of those different things and understanding, does everything that we have align with our existing standards right now for quality, consistency, production readiness, security, compliance, without having to look at them individually and applying those different lenses individually? And then the third layer here, all the way at the very top there, is self-service. Being able to deploy software in line with standards that you have and making that process as easy as possible. And so these are the three main pillars of any internal developer portal. This is not just Cortex, any IDP that exists. We'll talk a bit about some of the differences here. But one important note here is what we just looked at from the developer survey about what developers are looking for, the pain that they actually have, map incredibly well to the way IDPs are set up. And obviously that's not an accident. The reason why internal developer portals were created is in order to alleviate some of these main pain points for developers, but also enable them to work more consistently together without slowing them down, which is probably the most important part here. So I'm going to kind of peel into each one of these and talk a little bit more about the features that can help support each one of these different pillars. We'll start first with the system of record. So just the layer of unifying data under a common language solves the pain of developers' access to information. And what that feels like is making sure that developers don't have to dip into different tools. Now we know if you're a developer as well, you have certain workflows that you're used to on a daily basis. You know to check Jira, you're going to check your PRs in Git, you're going to move through your stack in a certain way, and that totally makes sense. IDPs enable you to just kind of push that work into one platform so you don't have to dip into the different tools all the time. You can kind of do a quick status check from one place. And now in terms of business impact, if we enable developers to just see things from one place, we have more data consistency, of course, across the different tools, but we're also helping them move faster. We're getting to production faster as well. And we know that the business benefits from faster go-to-market. So there's a couple different features I want to talk about. I'm specifically going to talk about and show Cortex features, but you can also think from an abstracted sense of the types of things that you would need in any IDP in order to further this work. So double-clicking in system of record, access to information is catalogs. So this is one of the core features that you might hear as you're thinking about IDPs. You might have an initiative around cataloging, and all cataloging really means is being able to bring all these different software assets that we gave examples of earlier into one place, being able to see the owner, being able to see dependencies, changes that were made. And again, all of this data is coming from that system of record, coming from all the different tools across your stack, so that you no longer have to ask when there's an incident, who owns this thing, who's on call for it, what was the last change that was made that might have been problematic. This isn't net new information. This is information that you would have been able to find going through each one of the different tools. So there's nothing magical happening here, but the aggregation of it's incredibly important because you're also getting more context from across the stack, so you can have an opinion faster and move through that incident faster as well.
I think it is a little magical, though, if I may just jump in, because of the fact that the data does come from so many sources. And because in your company today you might have, I've seen it myself, there are multiple sources of truth, which can't be a valid statement philosophically. And so the fact that your developer portal can go out to those different places and bring it in, and so that you've got a single view of your entire inventory is huge. And I would stress that this is so important. It might sound easy. Yeah, you just take a look at all the resources that you've got, but you simply cannot make business decisions until you know everything that you've got. And so I would really strongly stress anybody looking at a developer portal, make sure you've got all of your resources before you try to do anything else.
That's a good point. And I probably do take it for granted because other teams have a system of record. The marketing team has a system of record in Marketo. The sales team has a system of record in Salesforce. And I think everybody else in an organization tends to think, well, surely engineering does as well. Or we assume maybe it's Jira, but Jira is missing some of the pieces here around like ownership and changes. It has great information about ticketing, and that sounds like that's what the case is for a lot of engineering team. They have multiple different system of records, and they're pulling those pieces together. Does that sound right?
Yeah, certainly you're going to want to link at some point Salesforce to Marketo to Jira. And guess what? Each of the teams set it up slightly differently. Oh, your customer names are freeform. Oh, in this place, they're a pull down. This is all caps. This is lowercase. Now you got a problem. How are you going to do your translation? And so even at a small company like our own, which is relatively new, we're going to have these tools getting built out, and you're going to start to see these things build up. So you want to take a look at them. Think about your organization getting to 2x, 5x. Is it still going to scale with the way that you're managing your resources?
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually. And I just flipped through really quick because I couldn't remember if I put this extra slide in, but Cortex does offer 50 plus out of the box integrations with existing SDLC tooling. The value of that is that we've looked across all of our different customers. We understand how they model their data. We understand how these different tools fit together and to do that normalization work as well. But I mean, Jeff, you probably know this as well when you're onboarding folks, that process of figuring out your information architecture, if you haven't already done it before, moving into an IDP is just so important to get right, to make sure that you're avoiding these situations where one tool is defining a field this way, another tool is defining a field that way, and putting the mental load on the developer to figure out the differences there.
Yeah, and that process can be really rewarding for you as an organization because you already have some kind of a hierarchy defined if you're building your product. You have a way that you're ordering your products, your services, but to really step back and ask yourself, is this the right way that we want to model it? Are these all of our services? Is this correct? Do we have a domain hierarchy? Have we ever used one? Is there a reason to have one? To actually have that conversation with your organization can be really, really beneficial.
Yeah. And thanks for that. I know we spent a lot of time on the slide here. If we haven't kind of expressed it already, Jeff and I feel very passionate about the fact that the system of record, the bringing in data from everywhere, is probably the most important thing when it comes to an IDP. Whether you're building it yourself, using an open source version, using a vendor, there are ways to abstract away a lot of that work. Like with Cortex, we bring in 50 plus of those integrations already, but you can also bring in custom data too. The next thing I wanted to go through here is just the ability to search for information. So catalogs obviously make things available if you know the resource or asset that you're looking to find more information about. But there are situations where you're going to have to reverse that, and you know the quality of the software or a feature of the software that you're looking for, and you want to find out how much of the software matches it. So a really good example would be customer of ours, SoFi, during Log4j, needed to find out which software was running an outdated version of Log4j and quickly identify those and then create a task to make sure that everybody went to go and update it. So we have something called Cortex Query Builder, which enables you to ask those nuanced questions of your entire software catalog to find the answer really quickly. The other thing I wanted to mention here around data was plugins. Another really key consideration with internal developer portals, which enable you to visualize data from anywhere in your stack. We mentioned earlier, we know that developers have workflows that they are already really used to. You might even have systems that you're using internally that Cortex or other IDPs couldn't have access to or couldn't understand, but you still want to bring that context into the single interface. If this is the interface that your developer should be using to see across their entire stack, you'd also want to bring in data as well. So plugins for Cortex enable you to bring those visualizations in anywhere. Jeff, do you know of any examples offhand of how customers are using plugins right now to kind of bring that example like folks?
Sure, yeah. I think a key thing here is that you want to make sure that your IDP is extensible. One of the things that I saw when Workday tried to build their own is that it wasn't initially extensible. So what did teams do? They exported the data, they put it into a spreadsheet, they made augmentations, and then they started passing spreadsheets around. And that's definitely what you do not want to do. You want your IDP to be the source of truth. You don't want multiple sources of truth. So in order to do that, you have to make sure that you've got multiple ways to get data in. So Lauren has mentioned that with 50 plus integrations, Cortex has a way to pull in all of that data. But for anything that you might be using that's not supported by one of those integrations, or you have something else in your organization, what Cortex supports is the ability to push data in with custom data. So you can augment the model that way, or you can create plugins. So a good example might be, Lauren talked about pulling in data with Sneak, but maybe you're using another security vendor and you want to make sure that you can model that data in Cortex. What we've seen some customers do is they would use the Cortex API, they would push data in as custom data, and then they would write a plugin which allows them to model that security data right directly in the IDP. So this becomes very, very important that you don't have use cases that you can't cover and people are going to leave your IDP for some other tool or solution. Make sure you have a way to model it, no matter what that is, directly in your IDP.
Thanks for that, Jeff. That was great. Moving into the next layer of IDPs here, we spent a little bit of time on the features around data aggregation, data modeling, access to information. Now let's move into the second layer here, the assessment layer. And what this is going to solve for developers is the ability to prioritize tasks according to business needs of standards enforcement as well, without slowing them down. So some examples that we can talk about. There we go. Sorry, some examples that we can talk through. How this information shows up for developers is critically important. So we've got the developer homepage in Cortex, which is enabling developers to not only see all this information, which I know on the surface can sound kind of overwhelming. How did we really solve a problem? If we're bringing all the data in from everywhere and everything has an alert to it, how are we solving information overload for developers? The way Cortex is set up is that you don't just have access to all of the items in your catalog, you also have access to a view of priority tasks that align with standards that your business has set up in scorecards and in initiatives to drive improvement across the business. So let's say that there's a short-term initiative to upgrade a certain software component, or maybe AWS has end-of-life initiatives around something, and that has to happen in the next month. That's going to take priority over some of the other tasks, which might be a longer-term project to improve security maturity or operational maturity. But it also enables developers to kind of chip away at these things too. We have a quick view at the very top, which lets folks say, what can I get done if I only have an hour to improve kind of these standards across the board? Jeff, sorry, did you want to say anything about the dev homepage here and kind of prioritization of tasks?
No, I think you got it really good. I think that to have a centralized place where you can bring in information from Git, from Jira, from Cortex itself to show the things that you need to work on, whether it's Cortex or any developer portal, that becomes key because you start every day. I've talked to many colleagues who say, you know what, I don't really know what today's going to bring because there could be some firefighting exercise that you have to go through. There might be something that's just going to bubble up. So to have a way to show that becomes very critical.
Right. One of the things that I wanted to mention too, I know that I just skipped right past this. I wanted to get to that dev homepage first. We're doing it live here, folks. So I wanted to mention here was bringing in all that data. I know I mentioned data from lots of different tools, but the important thing here is using all that data to create rules and monitors for those developers to know what things to prioritize. So I can create scorecards in Cortex. Also, you can create scorecards in other internal developer portals as well. This is a pretty key feature of IDPs. But the value of using Cortex is that we've got data from pretty much anywhere in your stack of tooling that you're already using. You can use it to create scorecards that are bringing in different standards for service maturity, security, operational excellence. And you can do all of that in one scorecard if you really wanted to. We've got an example here, onboarding scorecard, which is a mix of different things. You have an on-call rotation set up in PagerDuty. You're pulling from Datadog to make sure you've got the SLOs set up. You're pulling from Git as well. So you're pulling from all these different tools just to make sure that your software is actually ready to be deployed. Or you can create very specific initiative focused scorecards as well. Maybe you have a scorecard around migrating to Kubernetes. We've had customers do this as well, where it's going to check for Helm charts, and it's going to look across all the different data sources, check for the most recent status of things, and then provide a score here that's always updating, so you can see the health of all of your different services. And you can sort that by team or individual or even product line if you wanted to.
Yeah,
So,
I see scorecards. Sorry to jump in, Lauren. I think the scorecards, I really see them having those two pieces of functionality. One can be the overall health of your service, just taking a look at various metrics, whether it's coming from your application performance metrics tools like a Datadog or a New Relic, or you're taking a look at number of Git commits. And that can kind of show you your overall health if the rules that you've crafted make sense for your business. But on the other hand, I see it as being very helpful, especially for teams that have hundreds and hundreds of microservices, where you can test those discrete things that you just started talking about. Just a quick example I might walk through. Workday was implementing Kubernetes, and they were originally using Linkerd for their network infrastructure, and then they moved to Istio. And they had to ask 500 different services, make sure you've got your updates in. That becomes very, very difficult to track. If you have a scorecard that can go into that infrastructure, can take a look at Git to see if that's been taken care of, you get rid of what a lot of us like to proverbially talk about as herding cats. It's a very difficult thing to make sure you've got hundreds of people all doing something. Scorecards are a way you can do that.
Yeah, that's definitely the primary value prop that I've seen from customers in our conversations is it's not that folks are starting from scratch. Folks are already using a lot of different tooling to try to hit these standards. It's just that all of them are happening in different places and have slightly different definitions, or in a scenario where you're kind of hitting everybody with the same alerts, and then folks don't know if it applies to them or not. And then again, they start to kind of ignore those things. Well, I don't know if this applies to my software. I don't even remember what thing I own, or if they've just onboarded, they don't know what standards they're supposed to be paying attention to. So just the simple ability to centralize those things in one place and track changes has been really impactful to folks.
I agree.
So moving into kind of the last layer here, which is probably the one that developers, again, might feel the most excited about, just being able to move things into production quickly. And of course, this benefits the business because we have reduced time to market while trusting that the software that's going into production is hitting all the standards that we actually require. Ooh, here we go. So the first thing I want to talk through here is a feature called Scaffolder. This is just our name for how we are setting up, enabling you to bootstrap new software elements based on standards that you require. So it could be a forced form fill. You've got to fill out all these different fields here. You have to make sure that these certain things are done first before you can move it to production. And obviously, this is going to reduce code for developers. It's going to make sure that everybody's shipping things in a consistent way. And that we also are tracking these things as well and tracking progress to getting them out the door. Kind of related to that as well is a feature called actions. So being able to configure no-code events or actions, if you will, that send custom data from Cortex to any API. So we're actually pushing things out into production. Jeff, I don't know if you have any more examples here. I think we have one moving from creating the service in a Scaffolder and actually creating it in Git, and then it appears in the service catalog. Any other examples you can think of?
Yeah, that's one. Some people have written actions such that they can push a deployment through GitHub Actions directly from their IDP. I've seen organizations that want to validate that someone has taken a look at their service data and to make sure it's up to date. They wrote an action that allows them to use the Cortex API to say, yes, I have validated this data, writes their name and a timestamp. So a lot of different use cases. As long as you can write something to an API, you can do it.
Perfect. The last thing I wanted to cover here is just the reporting element. We kind of spoke about the ability to track progress across all the different teams, but we really can't gloss over how important it is to see all of that information in one place and how powerful it is to not use this in a punitive way to say, oh, these teams aren't hitting their mark, but use it in an informative way to say, why aren't they hitting the mark yet? What other priorities do they have in motion? How well staffed is the team? How well prepared have we made each one of these individual developers to set them up for success? So if you're seeing situations where maybe in the bird's eye view, you're looking at how given teams or product lines are performing according to the different rules that you have set up for a given scorecard, and you see maybe red across the line. Well, what's exactly happening there? Is it poor performance for the entire team, or do they have other initiatives they're focused on? And bringing in all this context into one place becomes really important before you make decisions that are going to affect the entire engineering team.
Yeah, I would just stress definitely not punitive. I think developers have a love-hate relationship with metrics because at times you feel like you're being graded on your performance. I see it definitely in a different light. I see it as an opportunity for you to showcase where you've had those competing priorities and perhaps why you have not had the time to work on those security features that have been requested because of the volume of actual code features that are going out. And these can become tools that become very helpful for your leadership to figure out, you know what, I've heard you talking about additional headcount needs. I guess you were right. This might be a way that we can take a look at it. So I see it as the opposite of being a punitive type of report.
Yeah, actually, that reminds me of something that Christina, our director of engineering here, just went through. She was on vacation for 2 weeks, which is great. We love an open vacation policy at Cortex. But the issue was when she came back, she was looking at some of the data across the engineering team. It felt like productivity was a little low, and she realized it's because she was actually the blocker on getting a lot of things into production. And when she realized that, it helped her rethink how she should be operating, because here's the negative impact that happens to the entire team. And it also gave her a way to go to leadership to say, I'm actually going to need another headcount. I need a manager that's going to be here when I can't be here. So it seems very simple, but just being able to have the data that supports what you actually need as a team to move forward is hugely powerful. So before we get into some of the questions that we have, thanks folks for dropping those in. I did just want to talk about, we talked about a lot of features here already. And I tried to align explaining the kind of main pillars of an IDP with how it helps individual developers do their work better, with how it helps the business move forward as well. But we did talk about a lot of different stuff, right? So we've developed something here at Cortex called the IDP maturity curve, which helps folks think through the different steps that they'd want to take on the way to operational excellence. We do have tons of folks that come to us to say, the number one thing I care about is actually that thing at the bottom there, which is developer self-service, because that's all my developers talk about. That's where I want to start my process. And you can do that. You can start providing templates for developers to be able to drive consistency in the way that they work, and then that'll populate the catalog and you can move forward from there. But we've also found that folks tend to have the highest success when they're focusing on their information architecture first, aggregating data from everywhere, aggregating all the different data sources you might have across your entire SDLC stack, then applying standards, understanding where things are at today, where's your health at right now, where are the gaps, what do I want to prioritize? Do I want to prioritize an onboarding scorecard to make sure everybody's aligned? Do I want to prioritize a security scorecard because we just had some incidents or we're shipping a new product? And then moving into developing that prescriptive list of things for developers to follow. And this can be a collaborative effort between head of engineering, developers themselves, maybe SREs, maybe DevX persons as well. We've had lots of different personas involved in this part of the process. Then enabling devs to actually take that information and move quickly without getting caught up in a lot of the back and forth for approvals. And then you reach that optimization step of how do I make this even more tuned into developer workflows and bring data from other places with plugins as well. So this is just kind of an example of how we've seen a lot of customers be a little bit more successful. Jeff, you started onboarding customers as well. Do you have any anecdotes about how folks have thought about this before coming to us, and then maybe how the onboarding has gone?
Yeah, maybe I can give a little analogy because I was trying to figure out a good way to explain this. And I would say, imagine you've moved into a new house or you've moved into a new apartment and you haven't taken a full inventory of everything you've got in that home, but you really want to fix that kitchen up. You really shouldn't start working on making changes to that kitchen until you know everything else that might need your attention. So what if you find out that you need to take care of the plumbing, or something with the air conditioning, but you've started to tear apart your kitchen because you were so excited to get that done. That is my analogy on make sure you aggregate, make sure you've got a full inventory of everything you've got before you jump in. It's tempting. You're so excited. You want to take a look at starting to make the changes that you want, but you got to start with the bare bones basics. And so what I've seen with some of the customers that I'm working with is they've actually taken a big step back to take a look at, you know what, I think the way that we've modeled our data isn't necessarily the way that we'd want to do it now that we have an IDP, and they use the IDP as a springboard to go back and remodel maybe in some of the integrations where they're pulling data. They say there's a better way that we can align everything. And it's kind of like that natural progression, I think, from everything developed in a silo to now I have everything in one central location. Let me make sure I define it everywhere else in a uniform manner.
That's a really good analogy. I haven't heard that from you yet. You should be in market.
I just made it up. Thank you.
You're hired. Okay, so that's kind of all we got right now. I hope that this was useful, or at least help folks reframe the way they're thinking about some of these components here. But I do want to call attention to the fact that we are going to have another webinar on December 5th. To learn a little bit more about what Cortex has planned in this space, which is actually probably a very good segue into one of the questions that we already got. So somebody had asked earlier, we were talking a lot about developer productivity. We were talking a bit about measuring developer productivity. How does current tooling that helps measure developer productivity fit into an IDP? Jeff, I don't know if you want to kick that off or if you want me to.
Yeah, you know what? I do want to tackle that one, but I do see we have one question in our Q&A that I'll make sure that we get to, and that comes from Jeff, and he says, this might be an impossible question to answer, but how do we gauge how long it would take to roll out Cortex? And the way that I would answer that, and the way that you have to assess this with any IDP that you might use, is let's start with the installation look like. So with Cortex, it has an on-premise install, and it also has a cloud version. If you selected a cloud version of a tool, you're going to have a much quicker path because all the work is done for you. We talk about that paved path, that golden path, that's being done for you. And then it's a matter of being able to connect integrations and start to pull in the data. So this can be something that can be done as quickly as a couple of weeks, a week, depending on the connectivity that you've got, but it also depends on the complexity of your integrations, the amount of data that you need to pull in. So Jeff, if that answered your question, let me know. If not, if you want some clarifying answers, be happy to take a look at them. And then Lauren, your question about some of the developer productivity things that we've seen. I think that there's a natural inclination to take a look at developer metrics like number of PRs, number of commits, those types of metrics, and to see how they tie back to thinking about your slide you showed earlier in the presentation, the outcomes, the impact, how is that making a difference? And I think that although you can show those changes, I think you have to take those with a grain of salt with some of the other bigger picture things that you're taking a look at. Like you had that bird's eye report that you were showing earlier, that just purely showing the number of commits, the number of PRs, taken out of context without application to some of the other metrics that you've got can be a little bit misleading. So I think what you want to do is you want to take a look at some of those statistics across your entire stack, across various metrics, so that you can make sense of them.
Yeah, that's a good point. We've also heard folks, like you said, measuring different things to the extent that they can in Jira or Git. What do the number of commits look like? What does MTTR look like right now? Borrowing some from the DORA and space metrics. And then what it feels like where the gap is right now is doing something about that to drive changes in how the team is actually operating. And so to your point, you could then maybe use an IDP to say, all right, here's where we're at today. Here's where I want to get folks to. And maybe I'm going to create a scorecard that's going to set these different standards. So you've got too many vulnerabilities right now where it's taking too long to remediate things. I can set that as maybe the lowest level minimum for a given, operational maturity scorecard, and then watch folks kind of move up the stack. So you're enabling them to understand what good actually looks like, giving them freedom in the prioritization room to actually go and focus on that thing, and making sure that you're taking account of all those things together in one space.
Yeah, and to me, it seems almost impossible without an IDP to do that. I think about where I was before at Workday, where they said, we want to improve the quality of our weekly patch. Well, you've gone down this road of a microservice deploy. Now you have hundreds of microservices. So you might have issues from multiple teams. So how do you evaluate that data to know, is this team working better than this team? Are there changes that are needed? Is it a security issue, performance issue? And I think that it's almost like humans, I think, can remember like 7 numbers. That's why you can remember a phone number. When you start to have hundreds of services, that's just something that you can't really understand intuitively, and you have to have tools that'll help you visualize it.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And also just to clarify too, it's not just services. If not everybody has moved to like a microservices model, it's anything really, any type of software that you feel like is starting to sprawl. If you're on a monolith, you've got maybe multiple different monoliths. That doesn't mean that you can't use an IDP. It really comes down to, do you know who owns what when it matters most? And do you know how to drive change across the entire business when you have a short-term initiative that feels like an emergency, or a longer-term quality improvement initiative? And if you answered yes to those things, then you probably need an IDP. All right. I think that we are right at time right now at 11 o'clock. This wig is killing me right now. I don't know why. I feel like it's cutting off my circulation. So I'm excited to get this off. Thank you all for joining. I really appreciate your questions. I hope we see you again on December 5th. Again, we have more to say here around developer productivity and the tie into internal developer portals. So would love to see you there. But for now, thank you. Have a happy and safe Halloween. Thanks, Jeff.
Everybody.